Hi, I'm Winna Lau, a Program Manager Senior with the Georgia Department of Education, and I'm here with my colleague, Karen Suddeth, who is the Program Manager for our multi-tiered system of supports. Karen, would you like to say hello today?
Good morning, everyone. We're delighted to be here today and be able to share this information we've prepared with you.
We'll be talking today about 3 considerations for MTSS leaders in 2021: recover, re-examine, and re-engage. We all know that we've been through very unique circumstances over the last 18 plus months with the pandemic. Certainly there are many challenges about how we've been able to conduct school in a traditional way as well as a non-traditional means. We also are coming from many varied aspects about how the pandemic affected our particular regions. You can see, of course, from the slide that it showed you our presenters' information. Our session considerations are: how do you recover expectations, practices, and infrastructures needed to meet the unique needs of our students, our educators, and our families? And yes, definitely this is, the high focus is on students, but it's also our educators as well as our families. How do we re-examine the needs of all students with effective assessment and data-based decision-making processes? Re-engage and/or continue to nurture necessary and positive relationships with all stakeholders, including families and parents. In some ways, it almost feels like we're starting over. So we've got to make sure that we get back into positive routines and that we make sure that we are carrying out best practices. Georgia adopted the national aligned MTSS framework model that you can see was adapted from the American Institutes of Research. From the beginning, when Georgia was initiating the MTSS framework, we decided that we wanted to also ground it in a framework of infrastructure. So that's why you see the platform that falls below the graphic that is probably very familiar to most of you as a nationally aligned MTSS framework. So our infrastructure for MTSS in Georgia, we've included leadership, effective teaming, professional learning, family and community engagement, and communication. We know that without the infrastructure, that the best possible processes in multi-tiered system of supports will fail if the infrastructure is not in place to support this work, if the leadership is not behind it, if we do not know how to effectively team, if we don't have effective professional learning. We have to engage our family and community support. And good communication is, of course, essential to the success of any initiative. The great leader truly understands that effective communication is the key that unlocks the door to trust. And that really sums up what we're going to be talking about as we move forward this morning. Leaders must provide viable connections between the shared vision. We know that if we don't make that explicit connection, that sometimes we don't have the support that we need to carry out the mission. We need to focus on continued improvement efforts, ongoing feedback loops. Feedback is essential to understand what is going on and how we can improve our processes, as well as the MTSS framework has to be in place. And there, of course, could be challenges, especially if you have not been in the traditional building setting for a number of months. It may be that your MTSS process is carried right on, and that is certainly the hope that we have. But if you need to rebuild and reinitiate those processes, now is the time to get that back in place. We know that children are going to have been impacted by many different ways throughout the unprecedented pandemic. So we must have the supports that are in place to move forward. You've got to consider all aspects of infrastructure needed for MTSS implementation, of course, including things as basic as schedules. If schedules are not aligned, in order to allow time for interventions or effective teaming, as well as the resources that are needed, your efforts will not be successful. You've got to demonstrate a commitment to refine practices through intentional selection of professional learning. Now, we've all been bombarded with having to learn new things and how to deliver instruction virtually, how to deliver instruction in a hybrid model, possibly have a classroom of children, plus some that are online, and we're going to have some of those challenges ongoing. There's no doubt that we still will have those challenges to face. But we've got to be very strategic and intentional in the professional learning that is needed, but not just offer a smorgasbord of selections, but again, very focused, strategic, intentional professional learning. To promote MTSS as a high priority could not be emphasized enough. MTSS is really the answer to all the various challenges that we're going to face. And we've got to remove barriers to the implementation of this framework. And I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Karen now.
Thank you, Wenna. I appreciate your introduction here. My colleague has just talked with you about infrastructure. She's also shared the importance of leadership and the qualities of effective leadership. At one time or another, every leader is challenged to deal with something that is out of the ordinary. I think of a time when I was high school principal, and I can recall a few of those challenges that were out of the ordinary. For example, we had a school bus accident. We also had a gas line to break, and we also had mercury contamination in our gymnasium. So these are the types of things that you do not read about in your textbooks when you're preparing to become a leader. It's also difficult to prepare a PowerPoint that would have all the possible events that could occur and how you should react for each one. So we lean on our experience and we lean on good judgment, and that is what is really important here. And I'll tell you this about the challenges because, as Wenna said, this is an unprecedented pandemic. So every leader in our country and leaders around the world have been challenged to navigate through this pandemic and try to restore school for our students for sure. So the three considerations that we want to talk about are here, and I want to share with you that recover is a broad term to ensure attention is given to those who may need tiered supports to meet with success. Now, we do not want to imply that every student that returns to school is going to have a learning gap or is going to be in need of some kind of support or tiered support. But we do want to make sure that we are attentive to those needs because, as Wenna indicated, some of them may come to us and perhaps their family had lost some members through the pandemic, or maybe some other things occurred while they were not with us. But we also want to make sure everything is on target for learning and how we can support students in any way. So then as we go clockwise, we look at re-examine. And this is where data comes in. The process of utilizing data to determine the learning needs and progress of students. We have to lean in on our data now, and we have to make sure that our screeners are appropriate and that some of the other early warning indicators or indicators that we look for help us determine what needs the students might have. And then we're going to move on down to engage, re-engage. And this is not to say that you haven't been engaging. As a matter of fact, some teachers have reported that parents have been more engaged because they have been involved with their child's lessons that are on Zoom or other types of virtual portals. But we want to make sure that the engagement continues, and we want to nurture it, and we want to make positive relationships at all levels. So now the three considerations that we've introduced to you, we broke down into these flags. And so these are critical components of each one that we are going to talk about today. So when you think about recover, we want to talk about core instruction, closing gaps as needed, high leverage practices, evidence-based practices, and effective interventions. Your core instruction needs to be a rigorous tier 1. And how do you achieve that? Well, you achieve it by having evidence-based practices that align to the state standards or the curriculum that's been adopted by the district. You also incorporate those high leverage practices and evidence-based practices. And you make sure that the interventions that you're using are working. You do that by looking at progress monitoring, by finding out if the student is on the track to meet with the goal that's been established for the end of the year. And if that's not the case, then what adjustments do we need to make for that intervention? And you can look at the taxonomy of interventions that we use, that American Institutes for Research has shared with us. And you can look at, perhaps we need to look at fidelity of those interventions, or perhaps we need to adjust the intervention, maybe the frequency or the dosage, or the student needs additional support. So we look at all of that when we're talking about how to recover. So here are some questions for consideration. And we want you to think deeply about these. And as you go back to your states and your districts, that you maybe share these questions with other leaders as well. Did some of the students in the virtual setting thrive, while others may appear to have some learning gaps? We know that some students respond well in a virtual setting. And so not everyone that returns to us will have a learning gap, and they may not even have a need otherwise. But we need to think about that. We need to look at that. We need to find out if behavior, and going back to the routines that Wenna shared with you, are going to be seamless. Sometimes students who have been away in the virtual or hybrid model get out of practice with the routines and protocols of being in a school building. So how are high leverage and evidence-based practices used together to improve student outcomes? We look at the work that CEDAR has produced across the country, and we know that when you combine those high leverage practices and evidence-based practices, that the gains are even greater, that it's a very powerful model for bringing students forward in the curriculum and the learning. Is there a need for intentional professional learning to support district and school leaders, teachers, paraprofessionals, counselors, or social workers? And that's a big question, and you need to know what needs to be done as far as professional learning for each one of these groups, and it must be intentional. And I will probably mention this again later, but a leader's role here is to filter through all of the professional learning that is going to be offered. Your inboxes will be filled with all kinds of professional learning opportunities. You want to make sure that what you choose is targeted at what the needs are of the personnel, of the students, of the school, of the district and the state. Is there a process to determine effectiveness of evidence-based interventions? How frequently are you progress monitoring? How are you determining if the interventions are effective? And I mentioned that a minute ago when I was talking about looking at the effectiveness by seeing if the student is on a trajectory toward being successful with the goal at the end of the year. But also that progress monitoring along the way may show you that you should adjust or do something a little different with that intervention. There's also the ncii.org website that offers tools charts so that you can select interventions and know a little bit more about them and their success rate, as well as the recommendation for implementation and fidelity. You know, how long does the company recommend that this intervention be used? How frequent? How much per day? does a student need to be engaged in that particular intervention? So now we're going to move on to examine and re-examine. And re-examine is where we look at our data. And of course, data is the story. It tells us what we need to know. And so we need to be able to leverage those data sources and tools. We need to collect new data. We need to utilize data teams. Those data teams need to be dynamic. They need to be relevant. They need to engage educators so that good decisions are consistently made with the data in hand. There needs to be a process for analyzing the data and looking at what is it really telling us. And then from there, you need to determine what action steps are critical for helping students succeed. So questions for consideration here. Is the data system efficient and user-friendly to support database decision-making at all levels, from the individual student up to the aggregate district level? And that's an important question to ask. How are the screeners and assessments that you're using producing data that is user-friendly, that you can make sense of, that the teachers can take a look at and say, well, this is telling us this? So that is important to know. Also, how are screeners and progress monitoring tools reviewed to ensure effectiveness? And I mentioned that with the portion about recover as well. And we see it here again. So this is really an important piece to be considering. How does our screener tell us what is happening with a student? And we know not to lean solely on a screener. We have to look at those other early warning indicators. And especially when you get to high school or secondary levels, that's critical. You want to look at not only the results of the screener that you used, but also what does the student's historical attendance look like? What does their academic record show? What is their current progress in the classes that they have now? How many office referrals do they have? So those types of things inform us as data pieces as well. And they help us make a decision about whether a student actually needs an intervention and what type of intervention might be used. And then the progress monitoring tools measure the student's progress. So what is the process for regularly reviewing multiple data sets? So you want to know about implementation fidelity. You want to know about student outcomes and stakeholder feedback. And when we talk about implementation fidelity, I mean, if the company says that you should use this 3 days a week for 20 minutes a day, but your school or your district only provides 15 minutes a week or 30 minutes a week, then it's not aligned to what is recommended and you're not implementing with fidelity. So you need to really be sure of all of that information when you begin to use an intervention. And that way, the data that you do collect from that will be more on target for what you expect. And then the student outcomes, as I mentioned earlier, the trajectory toward the goal at the end of the year. Is the student on a trend line that's going to show us that they'll meet that goal? Or is the student underperforming where that trend line is tracked? So we need to look at that and make adjustments based on the data. And then stakeholder feedback. What do the teachers tell us about it? What do the parents say? What do the students report back to us about how the intervention is working? And so how are all these data sets used together to make mid-course corrections? We need to stop and take a moment to see, are we going in the right direction? Are we supporting students the way they need to be supported? And what corrections can we make along the way based on the data that we've looked at? So one thing I did want to share with you, Georgia has invested in what we call the Georgia Online MTSS SST application. This is accessible through the SLDS, and so every district in Georgia has access to this tool that is housed in the SLDS. This allows educators to track what interventions are used and how students are performing. It also allows us to set up the graphs that we need to look at to see those trend lines. It also sets up notifications for parents so parents understand where the student is performing, and also sets up if we should have to have a student support team meeting. And student support team is unique to Georgia. However, it is a process that many of you probably follow where you're looking at whether or not we need to move forward with a parent consent for evaluation and what strategies and tools or practices have we incorporated to try to meet the needs of the student. So the database individualization is somewhat aligned to Georgia's SST. So this format that we gained came from Maryland's online IEP system, and it was developed by Johns Hopkins University. But we are happy to share this with you at any time. We're very proud of how this works for us in Georgia, and we have multiple districts and schools that are now engaged. And I don't think I mentioned, but it does include Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. So now we want to talk about re-engage and what district and school planning is in place. How are leaders, teachers, and students re-engaging with the return to school buildings? Are some of them choosing to still remain hybrid, or is there an option for students to be virtually engaged in school? Now that parents and students have experienced that, they may want to choose that permanently for their student. And then we want you to look at positive school environment. How are behaviors? Are there any needs for wellness or well-being? What do we need to do to make sure students return to the protocols and rituals that are established in a school building? And then family engagement. We are not saying that you have not been engaging with your families or even the community partnerships. We are saying that that shifted a bit when we all went to a virtual or a hybrid model. So we need to look at the shift as we return back to those brick and mortar schools. And what is that going to look like for us? And how can we engage parents and families at a higher level? How can we further develop those community partnerships? So emphasizing those strategic partnerships is an important piece to this. You want to make sure stakeholders are informed and that you have change leaders who are able to help move a staff through major changes like this. Certainly it was very sudden when we all had to deal with the pandemic, and there was a sense of urgency around change. Well, change leaders help us adapt to that needed change. And then you need internal partners throughout the school district and even the state. And you need those external partners that will support what's happening in a district and school. Families, again, and community members are very important, and they are part of the strategic partnerships that we should pursue in our districts and schools. So questions for consideration with this particular piece. What role do families play in your school and district's decision-making process? Is there a role that they should have? I know that in Georgia, when we include the student support team, parents are invited to that. But some parents have questions along the way about how can they be involved in their student as they receive tiered supports? How can they be involved in the student's education? And we certainly need parents to be involved. What strategies might your state, districts, or schools use to engage and involve families? Are there some new ones that we've realized while we were in the virtual world and the hybrid world? How are outcomes and successes communicated to stakeholders? How have you done it in the past? Has that changed since the pandemic came? Are you able to move to a more virtual model or to have a blended model where you perhaps do newsletters or letters to parents or postcards? Or are you doing online sessions? Are there fireside chats or coffee and chats that you offer? There are different ways that you can communicate outcomes and successes. And who are the champions of this work? And how do we leverage those champions to help us move the work forward? Has the state, the district, the school established a common language? And what are the expectations and standardized materials to promote efficiency and sustainability with this work? So now we come back to the original model that I shared with you about what we should consider. We need to recover, re-examine, re-engage as we begin to restore classrooms across the country, as we restart America's schools. So the 3 R's that we've always known, reading, writing, and arithmetic, have now turned to become recover, re-examine, and re-engage. But wait, there could be barriers along the way that you need to be prepared to navigate. And the very best way to navigate barriers is to have a solid infrastructure so you can never invest too much time in developing that infrastructure. You need to be certain all teams are dynamic and relevant, that they understand their role and what the practices are and why this work is important. You should never meet for the sake of meeting. Ensure that adequate support and accountability are provided. This is important as students return to schools, and we need that support not only for students, but for teachers and leaders as well. How are we working together to provide the accountability needed? Avoid having too many competing priorities or initiatives, and we are all guilty of this at one time or another, where our priorities and initiatives are so broad, but there is no depth to them. And teachers become confused and some of them give up. So, and leaders are the same. So you take all of those priorities and initiatives and you align them in your strategic plan. That's what's important here. And again, you want to make sure that professional learning is intentional and targeted to the need. As I said, there are so many options that are coming to our inboxes now. And there's a lot of funding that's being provided by the federal government to help schools restore and support students. And trust me, the vendors out there know this money is landing in states and school districts, and they will be approaching you with all kinds of things. So our role as leaders is to filter through what's necessary, what's important, what is going to keep us on track for the goals that we've set. And then emphasize communication and establish those feedback loops. Remember the quote that Wenna shared earlier, that communication is the key that unlocks everything. So we need to be sure to communicate and provide ways for others to communicate with us and share with us what is working and what is not working. So I leave you today, and Wenna also, we leave you with the final quote, and that is, quality is never an accident. It is always the result of high intention, sincere effort, intelligent direction, and skillful execution. It represents the wise choice of many alternatives. And this quote is from Will Foster. And I think he's very wise in how he has summarized how quality is important to everything we do. So we thank you so much for joining us today. It has been our pleasure to share with you the ideas that we formed around recover, re-examine, and re-engage as we reopen America's schools. Thank you.